So if you cast your mind back to the mid-1990s, there was really barely any internet. Mobile phones were pretty primitive. There were about 4 TV channels. There wasn't constant children's television. And in the top of the pops, there was Oasis, Blur, there was Wonderwall. And you had a 3-year-old child. So maybe you'd been enrolled in the Children of the 90s study for about 4 years at this point. And maybe you've been having some difficulties with your child. Maybe they've not been eating too well. Maybe they're a bit resistant to new foods that you're trying to give them. Or maybe they're rejecting foods that they used to love and now they no longer do. Maybe this is causing a bit of stress and tension in your family, maybe with your partner, perhaps with your other children. Maybe you're having to prepare different meals for everybody, provide extra snacks for your child, and all in all, it's causing you a lot of worry. And to cap it all, questionnaires keep popping through your letterbox. And in those days, if you can remember back that far, we had postal deliveries twice a day. That's very hard to believe now, but post came twice a day. So in one of those questionnaires, when your child was about 3.5 years old, there was a question about whether your child was choosy and whether you were worried about it. And we actually asked you that question 4 times between the age of 3.5 and when your child was about 5.5. And during that time as well, we asked you lots of questions about what your child was eating. So some of you may remember filling in what we call food frequency questionnaires, which asks you about how often your child ate certain foods. And we also asked some of you to fill in very detailed diaries about what your child ate over the course of 3 days. At the same time, you were taking your child to the clinics and they were getting their heights and weights measured frequently. So what we wanted to find out was how common is picky eating in the children of the 90s, and we suspected that it would be quite common. We wanted to know what the sort of age profile was, so what the most common age for being a picky eater was. And we wanted to know much more about what picky eaters ate, so were there any foods that they particularly liked or that they particularly rejected. We also wanted to know something about your family and your environment to see if there was anything in your family or what you did or your circumstances that made it more likely that you'd have a picky eater in your family. And finally, we wanted to know about whether if your child was a picky eater, does that have any long-term consequences on their development? Does it affect their growth, for example? So these were all questions that we built into our study to have a look at with your data. So what did we find out? Well, at the age of 3.5, about 40% of your children were classified as picky eaters. So it's quite a high percentage, really. So it really makes it almost a normal behaviour to be a picky eater at that age. And it was very clear from our data that a lot of the picky eating seemed to have resolved by school age, so about 5.5. So that really gave us the idea that picky eating is a kind of expression of a child's growing independence and autonomy, and food is really being used as a tool with parents to try and for the child to try and express their independence a little bit more. And by the time they get to school and they have their own friends and they see people eating other things, that behaviour drops off. So there are some children in which it doesn't, in which that behaviour becomes embedded. But that's very few children. So what did we find about your family and what it was about your family and your circumstances that might have led to your child being a picky eater? Well, the thing that really jumped out at us was a question that we asked at 18 months. And that was a question about whether your child was difficult to feed and whether you were anxious about it. And what we noticed was that if your child was difficult to feed, had feeding difficulties, but you weren't anxious about it, then your child was not particularly likely to go on and be a picky eater. But if you were anxious and worried about it, then your child was more likely to be a picky eater. So all this is leading us to think, we need to kind of try and tackle this worry about children's eating at a very early stage. And what did we find about what children were eating? Well, this is where I come on to my vegetables. The children who were picky eaters were not very keen on fruit and vegetables. They ate far fewer fruit and vegetables than the non-picky eaters. But none of the children were eating enough fruit and vegetables, nowhere near 5 portions a day. So we really want to support all children eating more fruit and vegetables. We also found that they didn't like eating lumps of meat, and we think that this might link back to perhaps slightly late introduction of lumpy foods at the weaning time at about 8 or 10 months of age. And how this translates into nutrients, we did find that the picky eaters ate a little bit less zinc and iron, but it wasn't below national recommendations, so not something that we need to worry about too much. And as for their growth, we looked at how they grew right up to the age of 17, and we found that they tracked very nicely along the average, the 50th centile in the national growth charts. So it was quite clear that their growth and development was not being affected. What we also noticed about the diet, we looked at diet a little bit later on into their teenage years, so when they were about 10 and 13. And even in children whose picky eating behaviour had resolved by the time they were getting into primary school, we could still see that they were eating fewer fruit and vegetables than children who had never been picky eaters. So it does seem there's a little remnant of this type of eating behaviour, even tracking through into adolescent years. So we developed some recommendations, and our main message is one of reassurance, that this is almost a part of normal development, and that for most children, it will just resolve and go away with no harm done to their growth and development. So we really want to sort of put parents' minds to rest and reassure them that it's not something they need to have a huge amount of worry about. We would encourage families to eat meals all together, to have as many family meal times as possible, and to not get drawn into cooking special meals for each individual person. It's a good idea not to let your child have too many snacks, and certainly not to let them fill themselves up with milk in between meals. If children are wary of certain foods, and we know that children don't like these kind of green vegetables particularly, or if they're foods that are new to a child, you need to present them often. So maybe 12, 15 times before a child feels familiar enough with them to want to try them. But it's important that you don't pressurise them to eat foods. So show them foods, but don't pressurise them to eat them. And you can also lead by example. If you eat lots of fruit and vegetables, eat really nice, healthy food yourself, your child sees that as a normal way of eating and a good thing, and will probably copy you. So finally, I'd just like to say thank you very much for giving us all this huge amount of data that we've been able to do these studies with. And it's particularly the longitudinal nature of this data, the fact that you've been able to give us data over your child's teenage years and into young adulthood, that has been particularly helpful for us to look at long-term outcomes from picky eating. So thank you very much for your contribution. I hope you found this interesting, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.